I'm sure you've all had the experience of getting ready for a new course or redesigning your old one and feeling a little overwhelmed because you got to get your syllabus up, you got to make sure all your learning objectives align, you're thinking about your activities of what went well or what didn't go well, and every semester I always encounter this, and I'm sure you do, there's a lot of stress because we have deadlines and things like that. One thing that I've kind of learned working with faculty, and I'll talk about my experience here today, is that we always have this need to feel like we have to innovate and less time to feel like we have to do it. One thing I'm going to talk about today is I think AI tools or generative AI tools can help us feel a little bit more confident in streamlining some of our course design processes and experiences and how we create materials and how we look them over. And of course, every institution has some kind of they might not have a Center for Teaching and Learning, but they usually have some kind of faculty advocate program where they get to connect with people who can help them with these things. But I found that AI tools have been a great way to help me do that. So today I'm going to just talk a little bit about my experience and some things that I think AI tools can help streamline that can make your course design experience and your course prep experience just a little bit easier and a little bit better. My name is Matthew Bruce Ingram. I am a communication studies assistant professor at DSU or Dakota State University. I'm also our Center for Teaching and Learning director. And the reason I mention both of these kind of roles, and I have a couple other little hats I wear at my university, is I work with faculty all the time on their courses, and it helps me develop my own as well. But I work with all kinds of issues from designing the course from the ground up to also helping them refine issues that are happening and making their courses a little bit more equitable and the structure a little bit more dynamic. And so one thing I kind of want to think about in these different positions and pieces I've had is that we can use AI to help us with some of these course design elements. So I know we've heard from people talking about the student lens. I'm going to talk about the faculty lens today, and I have 4 things I want us to think about. I'm going to talk very briefly about intentional course design. I'll talk a little bit about how I've designed some of my courses with a little bit of an achieve in mind. And then I'll talk a little bit about how AI tools have helped me kind of rethink some of these things and sharpen them up a little bit. And then we'll just wrap up with a couple key little insights. So let me start by talking a little bit about, and I'm not going to go into whole depth here, but we know that AI has kind of shaken up the landscape for a lot of people and for a lot of reasons. But it's also turned attention to some issues that have been continuously growing, and so now's the time to kind of rethink them and fix those. I was just reading an article in the Chronicle the other day by Sarah Rose Kavanaugh, and she is an associate director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Simons University. And one of the things that she said in the article that I thought was really interesting is faculty are at a moment where they have to continuously innovate, and they have a lot more on their plate. And that is stressful, right? So how do we help them meet those demands where, right, we're continuously having more to do, but we're also continuously having to innovate, and that's exhausting, right? So if AI can help us just a little bit take some of those things off our plate, I feel like we'd be in a good place. Now, it's not going to solve everything, but it's got some pieces that I think are helpful. So in this kind of note, I'm just going to kind of use an example of a course design kind of approach that I use, which is from a really popular book called Creating Significant Learning Experiences by D. Fink. He, for many years, was a course designer or instructional designer, and he worked on exploring different ways that faculty can take those courses, and I like this idea. He had this big idea, which is, what is the course you ultimately want to have, the dream course, right? And how do you get there? And so he kind of takes a little bit of Bloom's taxonomy, does a little unique thing of his own, and his focus is on 3 things, or I'll talk about 3 things real quick that I think are important: caring, human dimension, and learning how to learn. So it's a little bit different than Bloom's taxonomy because it gets you to think a little bit about, why does this matter to my day-to-day life, and why do I, care about it? And second, how do I learn how to learn along the way? And so there's a couple different ways that I've used this approach. And we're going to look at a couple examples here of how I've kind of taken that way and kind of used it with AI to kind of design my courses. So I'll give you a little example of this. One thing I did in my interpersonal class, which I've only had a chance to teach twice at DSU, but in the second round, I really wanted to rethink it. And so one thing I've kind of done is I've used AI to kind of help me think through switching my course to what I felt like was a more traditional kind of course to a blended learning approach where almost everything was active learning, and the things they were doing outside of class, they were bringing into those experiences. And so I kind of switched that up a little bit. And one thing I did in that kind of course design was I emphasized in the thinking kind of approach the self-reflexive component, because in interpersonal, it's all about relationships. And so they have to be able to reflect on their own experience to make that meaningful. And so I really prioritized self-learning. And this came about through surveys they would do, discussions they would do, and then kind of fun. Every week, I would build a rhythm where every Friday there would be an active learning strategy that actually came from the communication world or an actual article. And so again, we kind of built up to the rhythm of them actually doing stuff in terms of applying what they're learning throughout the week. Now, on that kind of note, just to give you a little snapshot of what this looks like, in one of my classes, I build a rhythm, and sorry if this is kind of tiny, I build a weekly rhythm where they know exactly what to expect. And I want to emphasize this. This might look like just an online course rhythm. I actually do the same thing for my face-to-face. Doesn't matter whether it's face-to-face, online, blended, right? All of them have a rhythm, and I give them this kind of breakdown, which shows, right, during the week, you're going to do a before we get started activity where you engage in something before you even read or think about a material that we have in class. You're going to do a little activity that doesn't require any prior knowledge. It's about you, it's about your experience. All the way down to things like listen, watch, and read, where I'm going to have materials that pique their interest, right? If I'm using Achieve or those kind of things, it might be some of the readings from that, supplemented with some articles or videos. And then, of course, down at the end here, I have practice and apply, which is going to be something that they do where they actually take what they've been learning throughout the week and actually apply it to a real-world experience. So I mention this because we can actually use some AI tools to help us think through our course rhythm, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. On this kind of note, you can kind of see, and sorry, I tried to scroll kind of slowly. Here's an example from my course, actually. And so it's just kind of taking you through, but you can kind of see, and I don't have the luxury of having Canvas, so sorry if you have Canvas. I know Canvas is really smooth. I like Blackboard, but it's a little bit more clunky. But you can kind of see everything is built to that rhythm, whether it is face-to-face or online. Right? And so students know from day one what that rhythm's going to look like. Now, do they have to kind of enact it and play it out a little bit and see how it is? Yeah, they have to get a little feel for it. But again, this rhythm is kind of built through a structure that I found has worked more organically through my students. And again, I didn't come to this rhythm on my own. It came through practice and trying and trial and error and failure and coming back to it, right? So this rhythm, and I'm going to kind of mention this here, this rhythm helps create an experience that I think students can feel like they understand how to engage. They feel like it's transparent in the sense that they know exactly what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And what I think is kind of nice is it's equally modality friendly. It might require some tweaks, and in fact, I'll talk about that here in a second. But again, I think both approaches can be adapted to those pieces. Now, where does this come into the AI piece? The reason I kind of showcased all of that stuff is to say AI can help us fast track a lot of these things, thinking about our rhythm, thinking about our course design. And I really want to think about it as a dialogic partner. Now, I'll emphasize and put a little piece in here for transparency's sake, right? It's not going to solve all of our problems, but it's a good partner to talk with. So here are some things that I think are important we can do. We can do some more standardizing of our courses, and I know a couple of you here have talked about this. If you're a course director, whether you get the official title or not, it is a lot of work. And in fact, one of my courses alone took 2 years to really feel like I've created a solid course front to back that my adjuncts or my colleagues can use. So on this kind of note, it can also help us sharpen our language to digestible and student-friendly bites. Now, we do have to be careful, of course, about biases and things like that, but it can at least sharpen up the language so it has kind of a similar approach and similar kind of feel. Lastly, it can also be really good to identify gaps and barriers. And I know as professors, we are constantly seeking out critique for betterment, but it also can be hard when somebody tells you there's some issues with your course. It's nice to be able to ask AI, take a look at this assignment. Take a look at this course rhythm. Is there some gap or issue that you could identify that might be problematic? And again, I know it's hard to get those kind of critique pieces, but it's really helpful because it's just you, it's the AI, it's not you and your colleague, so you can get those pieces there. Now, on this kind of note, I'm going to show us, in brief, 3 kind of examples. And I'm not going to go into too much depth on each of them. You could go even further because I want to emphasize this. It's not a one and done shop. It's an iterative process. And for folks who've created courses that have to be used by multiple instructors, it takes a lot of refinement. So let's look at 3 examples here. And I have 3 examples that I've worked on and I've taken, you'll get a kick out of this, I've taken some of my old course materials and I've popped it into ChatGPT asking for some specific things. And I just want to kind of show you what it's capable of doing. So we're going to look at refining some learning outcomes. We're going to look at an example of a low-stakes speech assignment, and we're going to look at evaluating a course rhythm. So one thing I kind of did, and I've just pulled up a sample. I did a little test for us here today where I wanted to think about our learning outcomes first. So what I did is I took some examples of some learning outcomes that I had for a course. This was for my public speaking course. It was probably my honors public speaking course. And I just took some learning outcomes that I had that weren't bad, right? They weren't bad, but they weren't perfect. And learning outcomes, of course, right, usually for them to be really solid, they kind of have to be measurable. They have to be connected to actual assignments. And having worked with lots of faculty and also made these kind of things myself, sometimes we have these great learning outcomes, but they don't connect up to something we're actually getting to, right? So I did a little favor here and asked ChatGPT to take a look at my course learning outcomes and provide them in the format of the think taxonomy kind of approach. And so you can kind of see, and I'll just point out one example here. Look at this example that says research, select, and develop appropriate background and supporting material to support and extend a speech, right? That's a lot of things to ask in one learning outcome. So what's it going to do here? Well, it's probably going to break that down for me. So here we're going to look at some revised versions. Now here's what's great. Whatever framework you provide, right, it's going to mirror that framework for you. So I'm using the Think's taxonomy piece. It's going to break that down into the different levels. It's going to show you all of those pieces and how they relate to each of the dimensions of the taxonomy. Now notice that I'm not still quite happy with this one in application. It's the right area, but it's still too much in one piece. So I can always ask a follow-up here to simply say, you know what, I like these. But are there any issues with this particular set of learning outcomes? And it can kind of, again, assess whether it feels like they're holistic, whether they're integrated into the course right, whether they have that caring component, the component which has to do with them actually thinking about how they grow as a person, right? So it can kind of see those elements. But lastly, I mentioned that that one example is too much. So I can say, you know what, can you make all these outcomes one verb per outcome? And then what we can get here, which is really nice, we can now see my one that did like everything in one. Now it's broken down into research, appropriate background, and supporting material to support and extend the purpose of a speech. It also has deliver speeches extemporaneously. It breaks them down. Now I want to emphasize, it doesn't mean that this is perfect, but what's great about this little dialogue back and forth is it gets you to think about what your course design is actually doing or not doing for you. And that's kind of the key kind of piece here, right? I think we all, as experts in our areas, have these great ideas for students, and sometimes we don't realize, you know what, oh, I'm assuming they get that, or I'm assuming we're doing that, or it's not built into the way I originally thought. So that's just one example, and we could really keep going iteratively with this process. Now, one thing I like that's kind of interesting is I have assignments that I've connected to these, but I kind of want to see if AI has some other ideas. So I kind of said something like, what kind of assessments and assignments would I need to achieve these outcomes? Here is a really good learning experience, by the way. If you ask AI to kind of see what kind of alignment you're going to get, you're going to see all these different things that it has possibilities for: discussion boards, lectures, extemporaneous speeches, annotated bibliography. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. I haven't thought as much about the human dimension for this class, so it gives me some ideas here. Activities that focus on verbal or nonverbal expression, such as storytelling or role-playing. I hadn't really thought about that. Maybe I could integrate that. Again, it just has all these wonderful ideas that you can choose and pick or modify, and so I think it's just a great way to see what you're missing. For example, in another course, I have them work on oral citations. And I actually realized through talking with ChatGPT that there was 2 steps that I really needed to add into my course, which was actually giving them a clearer framework for how to cite orally and actually having them practice with their peers. So again, I learned something out of that dialogic process. Now, some other examples we can look at. I showed you the example above about the design of learning outcomes. Here's an example where I took a pretty underdeveloped assignment of mine, which was in every speech I usually have them do a little reflection on their own public speaking, and they hate watching them, but they're so important to watch because you have to know how you behave, right? And so here's an example, one that wasn't really that developed in my mind, something I did in the past. So I had a reflection assignment, and for this reflection assignment, what I asked them to do was watch the video that was recorded of their speech, and then I simply asked them a couple questions here where they were supposed to write that up. Now, what's kind of interesting is looking at this old assignment, I didn't really set parameters on like how long that had to be, as long as they just addressed the questions. So there are some issues of transparency and clarity here. So how can I make this better? So I gave it to ChatGPT and asked if it could look at and kind of review this for any kind of gaps. Now here's what's nice too. Again, think about this as an AI assistant course designer. What it's going to do here, and it kind of tells me, right, you have some clear instructions, you have some reflection pieces, which is kind of nice, but one thing it kind of identified here, and I thought this was kind of nice, it identified that there were some consistency issues I need to think about in how I title my assignment. There was not as much clarity in the criteria of how I'm going to grade that assignment, right? I said full credit and full points, but how clear is that? It talks a little bit about the length. You need to specify the length of how much they're going to write. They need to know those kind of details. So I mention this as somebody who, again, has had this experience, and I'm sure you all have as you've iteratively created your courses. There are just things that are easy to overlook when we're under these time crunches. So AI can really help you sharpen that up. Now, one last example that I'll show, and I'm going to go down just a little bit, is an example of a weekly rhythm. So I put in, and you can kind of see I talked a lot more about the assignment with ChatGPT to ask for things like checklist. But one thing I did is I plugged that rhythm in that you guys saw a little bit ago, and I asked it, what do you think about this rhythm? And so it can kind of think through and just spit back to you if that thinking is the same as you have, right? Again, is it the same way I think about the course? So it goes through every part of that course rhythm. It shows how it kind of thinks about these things. And this is kind of what I love. It just provides you some suggestions. And again, these suggestions might seem novel, but really they're the things I see in faculty across my university and other universities that do time and time again. So even though they might seem novel, right, they really are great reminders, like in this one. For your learning objectives, ensure that they are measurable, aligned, and go to the overall course goals. Second, use action verbs that are clear in their language, right? We know there are some fuzzy kind of action verbs like understand. Well, what do we quite mean there? We got to be clear about how that aligns and what that looks like. So again, these are just some examples of course design elements you can use. And again, like I said, the point that's really clear and important here is I'm providing information that I've created, and I'm dialoguing with it about the stuff I've made. And so again, you can use it in other capacities, but I think as a course design element, it's really helpful. So let me go ahead and return back to this if we can. We'll take a moment here. In this kind of piece, one thing that I think is just really nice to kind of get you thinking about this even a little bit more is there's so many wonderful guides out there about AI prompt building and how to use this more effectively. I'll just plug one that I think is really good. Teaching with AI, a practical guide by Jose Antonio Bowen and Watson. It's a really great book. And one of the things that I really liked from the book, and you can't see it all on here, is that they give you a nice little breakdown on how to make things the most effective. And so they give you some really great advice about the fact that you can make sure you have a specific task in mind. You tell AI the specific format that you want that in, right? Just like I did with the learning outcomes. I want it in Fink's taxonomy, and I want it to align with that. You think about the voice and style. This is why I'm providing my own materials and pieces here, because I want it to have a little bit of a semblance of my own style. And lastly, what's the context, right? Is it high school? Is it college? What level is the course? All of those things can help you get better answers to this. Now, there's a lot more we could talk about with this here, but I want to kind of be clear. AI, I think, has some really great potential to streamline for faculty in this busy time we're in this innovative time we're in. And there are several things it can do. It can help you refine learning outcomes. It can help you review your syllabus to make sure there are no mistakes. It can check for some accessibility in terms of inclusive language. It's not perfect, but again, that's why you have to take that second check through it. You can check for typos, mistakes, formatting issues. Consistency is a big one, right? Students like to navigate a course that has has a style they can understand, a rhythm that they feel good about, and they know how to navigate. And lastly, I think really importantly, it can provide some great suggestions and critique your courses in some great way. So I would just kind of end on this note by saying, as somebody who helps faculty in their advancement all the time, I think this is going to be a tool that I continuously use and train faculty on how to use, and be transparent about how it's going into their courses. Thank you.